Hi, Chris.
Hi.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, and you.
I guess I suppose the first thing I want to ask you is, what was it like when you started in genetics?
I think the word would be basic. I I came into genetics in 1988 because I needed a job and because it sounded interesting. But you'll remember that those days things were very rudimentary. There was not much we could do.
Yeah.
So I was appointed, I think, primarily because I was one of those nice young nurses, and I had a background in psychiatry, which I think helped them decide that I would be very, very good. Because you'll probably remember from those times there was not very much we could do scientifically, and testing was very rudimentary. And really, my job as a genetic counsellor in 1988 and for a good couple of years, 3 years after that, was primarily to do prenatal diagnosis counselling.
Right.
And I think a lot of genetic counsellors of my era, that's how they began. It was counselling people primarily because they happened to be over 36 and they were at risk of their babies were at risk of Down syndrome, and that's primarily what I did as a genetic counsellor. Because I had a background in psychiatry, I think certainly in my department, I was given a lot of the patients who came because they wanted to discuss things that had a mental health flavour, if you like. So people who wanted their chromosomes tested because they were actually male and they thought they were women, or vice versa. And so I was given a lot of what I'll call the kind of cases that were more had a psychiatric element. But primarily we were prenatal diagnosis counsellors.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, in 1988 there was no testing that we could do otherwise. I mean, I think that the gene for CF was found the year after I started or something. So there was nothing we could do. Very little genetics, but a lot of prenatal work. And obviously, once people had prenatal results that were bad news, we did home visits to talk about the after effects of termination, etc.
Yeah. So lots of psychosocial care.
Yeah.
But not so much science really back
then.
Well,
there was very little. With the benefit of hindsight, you can see this. I thought I was doing genetics, but there was very little genetics that I was doing or really could be done, unless you were a dysmorphic doctor who specialised in making diagnoses via a clinical route. But I think that that's it seems like a long time ago now, but actually it wasn't that long ago. I mean, 1988 is not that long ago, and that was a very different specialty.
And who was important then in your sort of development as a genetic counsellor, or deciding what a genetic nurse or counsellor was?
Well, I worked. I joined an existing genetic counsellor who'd been in post for a few years, but then she decided to leave shortly after I got there. I don't think there was a link. She told me there wasn't a link, but so I worked by myself until a couple of other folk were appointed. One as my original colleague's replacement, and two, a nurse to do some work with the Duchenne muscular dystrophy team. And so the genetic counselling primarily that I was involved with was seeing geneticists, counselling families who needed some kind of what I'll call psychosocial input. So, I mean, people like Caroline Berry, who was the person that actually appointed me, and at that time Martin Bobrow even saw patients, and I used to see, and they tended to get me to come and sit with them if they thought that the news they were about to give or the situation required some kind of follow-up that was not a medical follow-up. But obviously, from the very early days, I was involved with and took part in AGNC meetings. It was then the Genetic Nurses and Social Workers Association, if you remember, and the name was changed slightly controversially, but so it was people like people who left the profession a while ago, who, but I think you'll remember, people like Penny Gilbert, who was a very quiet but extremely wise person who was way ahead of her time in thinking through how genetic counselling was going to go and the need for training in genetic counselling. And Heather Skirton was a huge influence on my early days. And you, I've known you a long time as well. But so Heather was a huge influence, and I did a lot of work with Heather on counselling courses in Taunton, and I was in, I think, she was then the AGNC chair, and I became vice chair, and then I became chair when Heather left. So those were professionally, for the professional development of genetic counselling, they were the people who I remember extremely well. Mm-hmm. And also Lauren Kurtzen-Storer, because I got a place on the first, as a secondment from the department. I used to go 2 days a week. I got a place on the first MSc genetic counselling course in Manchester.
So when was that, Chris?
That was, I'm just thinking, that was about, I think it was something like 1994.
Right.
I think, yes, maybe a bit earlier, because I joined in 88, and I'd been working probably for about 5 or 6 years, so around that time. And I spoke to Caroline Berry and said that one of the things I was very aware of was the fact that I knew nothing about genetics scientifically. And, even though I could wing it because of being a nice nurse and having a psychiatric background, there was a lot of genetics was becoming more technical. Yeah. So I realized that I didn't even have a biology O level. So I was very aware that there was a huge gap in my knowledge, and that was already probably, but certainly would influence the my ability to practice safely and well. Yeah. And I was lucky that the unit supported me in getting a place on the first MSc course, which was fantastic.
So that first cohort, presumably most of them was working in the field.
Yeah. No, there were 4 on the first cohort. I was the only person working.
Oh, right.
The other 3 were science graduates. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 2 of whom, one of whom eventually went abroad, and 2 of whom are, senior genetic counsellors now in the UK profession. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I was the only person actually in practice.
Okay. That must have been hard.
It was different. I loved it. I loved the fact that we got proper genetic lectures. There was one set we used to do with the medical students. I think that Andrew Reid's clinical genetics sessions were with medical students. Mm-hmm. And we had to sit a clinical genetics exam. Rather a scientific genetics exam. And I remember thinking I will never pass, but I did actually. And I think because of my obsessional personality, I swatted and I did really well. But that was a revolution. That was a revelation to me, because there were so many things that language I'd used to patients and families that I didn't really have a profound understanding of, and I had a much better understanding. And obviously, the counselling aspects were terrific. And Lauren and her team were invaluable. That kind of changed my professional life very much. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Did that make a big shift in the way you thought about what you were doing and what you needed to be able to understand to do it properly?
It did, and I think that it meant that rather than winging it, when I was describing certain scientific concepts to patients and families, I felt more confident, and I actually knew I felt I knew what I was talking about. And that was so that input was fantastic, and I think it changed genetic counselling in the UK in all sorts of ways. Yeah,
I can't remember the timeline. I think we'd already started work on competencies before the master's course had been set up, had we, or not?
Do you know, I can't remember because I don't really have a memory of. No, I don't think we had.
Right.
Well, so, I don't think I wasn't involved. I think.
Yeah.
I think that I became involved in professionally more than once the MSc was at an end for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're right. My memory isn't great about that moment. But I think that it was post MSc for me. Yeah.
And I'm really interested in that master's because I've never done a master's in genetic counselling, as you know.
Yeah.
And Lauren is amazing. Did it make a difference having somebody come from a different country who had a different perspective, or not really?
No, I don't think it did. I don't think the fact that Lauren didn't come from the UK, because she practiced in the UK for years.
For a long time.
And I think, I mean, she had obviously practiced in the USA as well, but I think she had been in the UK a long time. And I don't think at that point I was aware of what was happening in any other country, and I think it was primarily UK clinicians and UK counsellors, and the fact that Manchester was a very sound and very go-ahead department with doing all sorts of things that I was interested in.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I didn't talk about sorry, I'm burbling here. What I most remember about one experience in Manchester when Seema Kessler came to do counselling course. You were there, weren't you?
I was there, yes, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely, I was, and and he and Lauren were good mates, and and I remember meeting him, and I remember sitting with it, and I thought he was extraordinary, and he was clearly Lauren's professional hero.
Yes.
For reasons I completely understood, and he was very charismatic and very clever and very wise and all those things. Yeah.
Yes.
So no, I remember that. Yeah, that those were. I can't completely remember exactly what year that was, but I remember that.
Yes. Yeah. And what was amazing about that course is actually it was mixed, wasn't it? There were obviously genetic nurses, stroke counsellors, but also medical consultants on it as well.
That's absolutely right. Yes, and Heather, I know I was involved in that, and Heather organised that. And yes, that's the only time I think in my professional life that I did any counselling course with doctors as well.
Yes,
and I remember the doctors who were there, and people like Di Donai and people who clearly were very admired and respected from a clinical point of view, but I came to realise that some of the geneticists had a really deep interest in understanding psychological and psychosocial things, and I was that was a very short course, and I did it, and our Tibin was there, and it was one of the highlights of my professional life and professional training, really, and I loved it so much, and and it's just such a shame that as far as I can tell, although those kinds of initiatives are not still around.
Yeah, I think they are a bit, but I think anyway that's a separate discussion, not about the development.
And actually, no, I'm not. I haven't been involved in the legal department for a very long time. So
yes. So, in terms of organisations or working groups that were important, you've talked about the AGNC, or NASWA.
Exactly, that's what it was, wasn't it? Yes, okay. So the things I remember from the early days, I'm just written them down to remind myself. Yes, the early discussions about developing a registration process with Penny Gilbert and yourself and Heather Skirton and other oldies, and at Guy's, where I worked all my professional genetic counselling life. There was we did some very good work, I have to say, primarily instigated by the non-nurse genetic counsellors on looking at a career, a sort of salary and career structure. Because one of the things, if you remember in the early days, was that people like you and I certainly was paid as a nurse, effectively, yeah, because I was a nurse. But the newly qualified MSc graduates were not nurses primarily, and so they had a career structure that nationally was very, very different and very diverse. Mm-hmm. And a group of my colleagues at Guy's, Gillian Scott being the person I remember mostly, decided that this was not equitable initially, but also it raised the point of having a career pathway in genetics, genetic counselling, yeah, and a salary structure and that was when the different banding came in, and the acknowledgement that there were different levels of seniority that you could work your way through, which is, as you know, in nursing was, we had that for years, but genetic counselling did not have that, and so I was involved in that, and I think that was very important, not just because I think it made pay more equitable, yeah, which I think it did, but it was the beginning of looking at what you had to do to progress through the career structure, and I think that was really very important. And other people were involved, but it was a primarily guys' initiative, and certainly initially, and there were other people on the working group, and including me. So. And yes, and okay, so the development of the MSc courses I've already mentioned. I think the Lawrence course, and obviously there was then one developed in Cardiff, were fantastically and central to the story of genetic counselling in the UK, central. And yes, the counselling courses we've already mentioned that Heather ran. I helped Heather organise and run some counselling courses in Taunton, and a lot of the genetic counsellors who were newly qualified, and even the ones who'd been around for a long time, came to those and were very involved, and I think they were very well received and very popular. Mm. And I think, I can't remember how many we did. I think Heather did more after I'd left the genetic counselling. I mean, the other formative thing for me, and that I was involved in after leaving Guy's clinically, was the Genetic Counsel Registration Board, but before that, what will be called the Joint Committee on Genetic Counsel Regulation. Do you remember?
Committee on J.
Joint Committee on Genetic Counsel Regulation.
Something like that. Yeah, I can't remember.
And I know you remember.
Yeah, I'm still part of it.
And you saw it, okay, yeah. And so, if you remember the early days of that, yeah. The prime reason for its existence was to look at what was going to happen about regulation, the regulation of genetic counsellors, because we all knew that something needed to happen, and it was just how to organise that and what to do, and how, yeah, and obviously, the registration process was up and running, and was very successful, and I think one of the reasons I never became registered was that there was a waiting list of to register, if you remember, to apply for registration, because they could only take a certain number of applicants a year, which is still the case. Mm-hmm. It was thought that I had an idea that I was going to leave the profession, so I thought that it was important for other people to have that. So I actually didn't register. I
didn't know that.
No, I was never registered. Yes. I escaped. So, which has been a huge irony, really, when you think of my involvement in the Genetic Counsel Registration Board. But that's by the by. I never claimed to be registered. And people, I think, always do that. But so obviously and what I'll say, that the various activities related to developing a registration process and getting that recognised. Mm. So the work that we did on, what was that group was called? The Joint Committee on Genetic Counsel Regulation, which Georgie Hall, as you know, was very central to, and that we took an application to the Professional Standards Authority and were recommended for statutory regulation. You remember that, and the joy of that day. And then the next year, the coalition government came and changed everything. Yeah. So it never happened, and as you know, that's what's happened since then, or rather not happened.
I remember walking up those steps on the way to that meeting.
Absolutely.
And then coming down the steps, being very happy that we.
I have a lovely photo
on with our lives.
Yeah. I have a lovely photograph of us on those steps.
Yes.
Remembering all the people who were involved, and lots of whom have obviously now left the profession, but that was a very important, and even though we didn't actually get statutory regulation, it was an extraordinarily important, I thought, acknowledgement that we were now a major and serious profession, small, but serious, and I thought that seemed to me to be a very important day in the history of genetic counselling in the UK. And then I think, the other thing to say that I was involved with Heather and Lauren was the getting the money from the Department of Health for the training posts. If you remember that after the white paper on genetics, primarily Heather led obtaining a large sum of money from the Department of Health to train genetic counsellors. And my memory is that there were about 50 people, most of whom are still in practice now, who were trained through that scheme, including Vishaka Tripathi, who, as you know, has been the chair of the GCRB. So people like Vishaka were trained through that scheme, and it was an extremely important scheme. And we were unfortunately it only had 2 rounds, and then the money was no longer available. But there are a lot of genetic counsellors, senior ones currently in practice, who went through that scheme. And that was very important in the development of genetic counselling training, particularly in the UK.
Yeah, I agree with you. And going back, and that I hadn't really thought of this, is the importance of the career structure. And because sort of my recollection is we part of the push to start the registration process, obviously it was about safety, competence, better care for patients, but it was also, we didn't want a split between the nurses and genetic counselling.
That's
and actually that career structure, and it aligned with changes in the NHS at the time, didn't it, about the way the whole
agenda for change and all, those payback things. But no, I think you're absolutely right. And I talking to you, I really only think about that was not a piece of work that got a lot of publicity.
No.
Because it was primarily done quite quietly, primarily at Guy's, but other people were involved from other parts of other centres. But it's I think that my understanding, although please correct me if I'm wrong, you're more recent than I am, but that career structure is still in place.
Yeah, it is.
And it meant that we stopped talking about nurses versus non-nurses. And I think that was a fantastically important development, and it was quite a quiet one. But it was really, and it laid out particular job descriptions of different grades, and the expectation of what you would be able to know and do at a particular. And I think that was very important, extremely important. But it's not something that got a lot of publicity, I guess.
No, I'd never thought about it until you said. No, I'd never thought about it, and it was really, really important. I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm interested in doing this and recording these stories is that I think it's important for people to know where we came from.
Yes.
It's not, we don't want to look back to the past. We're in a new future, but it is, and also to recognise that it was just people doing it, just ordinary people doing it,
who were already in more than full-time jobs. I think that I think it. Yes, I mean, I think about the clinical commitments people now have, or people who are in the profession and doing the job right now tell me about their workload, and we didn't have such a workload. I think partly because there was very little you could do in genetics. When we began, there wasn't that much testing going on. So, and genomics was not a word that anybody used, and so I think that we had more time to think philosophically about what we were doing and the nature of the profession, and how you could achieve standards, and yes, and I think that the nurse versus non-nurse dichotomy, I suppose, was took a long time to kind of address and resolve. Partly, I think, because some old people like you and I, who are nurses, were not very, well, they were resistant to the notion that these people were coming along, new young people coming along and joining them, and that we couldn't know. There used to be the Genetic Nurses and Social Workers Association. When that became the AGNC, that was extraordinary. I mean, that was really very controversial in many ways to many people.
Yes,
I don't think people probably know now, apart from old people like you and I, what the GNSWA were.
No,
social workers, because I don't think I ever met a social worker in practice. But that's
I mean, there was one, wasn't there?
There was one, exactly. There was one. There was one.
Wonderful Audrey. Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to record those kinds of, because I think that they are bound to have. Well, I think they already are having on them. If you're thinking about the scientists who are going through the I just had the STP training. That in a way, there's now discussions between STP graduates and trainees versus non-STP,
yes.
and so that kind of challenge of bringing people together in a profession with different backgrounds is still around. It's still an issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think possibly will remain an issue.
Yes. Yeah. And I think what we contributed was we sort of focused on the end point of what is done for patients.
Yes.
And what are the skills and competencies needed to do that.
And that became more obvious that was what we needed to concentrate on. Because there was a kind of what I'll call a bit of a self-interest kind of, we don't want these people to be paid more than we are, or vice versa, or people having a different training, and I think there were those issues because we're human beings, and we've been around a while, but I think that those, exactly what you just said is completely true. Those are the sort of ongoing and modern and future issues.
Yes. So we've been through. I'm just trying to remember. What have you got on your notes, Chris?
On my notes, I'm important developments, some of which I was involved with, is under the I think I've covered quite a lot of these. I wanted to talk about the Department of Health training scheme that I think was fundamentally important, and did it. Yes, the application. Yes, I suppose the current thing that I have less of an involvement with, because of my sort of retirement, is that becoming a part of the AHCS.
Yeah, the academic.
Yes, the
Academy for Healthcare Sciences.
Yes. Yeah. Which, as you know, is the current issue, because there's been ongoing and very major discussions over a number of years about how to gain statutory regulation, and because the PSA system didn't turn out for us, there have been various views about what we should do since that time, and I think it has been quite difficult. I've been mostly on the outside looking in, but from the conversations I've had and conversations I've heard, that it has been very controversial, and I think that realistically, I think we were only ever going to go by the AHCS route. It's the only route we have, but I can see people's reluctance to do that, because it was as if we were almost giving up on our profession.
What we've done is come full circle.
Exactly. So I think that's been something that I haven't been very involved with, but I've certainly heard and read, and I obviously been the administrator for the GCRB for quite a while, and those are obviously, I'm party to conversations about that make me think, a lot about what people are trying to achieve and how to get there. Although I'm no longer involved, well, I am still the GCRB administrator, but it's my resignation has been tendered. So because I'm kind of trying to properly retire and do other things, but I do know from listening to and going to GCRB meetings, which I go obviously not as an elected member, but I go as the administrator. There are lots of different views about that, and it's been I think it's been a very difficult thing to think through and resolve. And make everybody happy. You can't make everybody happy, but to make a case for doing this.
So I can remember AGNC, the first independent AGNC meetings where genetic nurses and counsellors actually did presentations being said. I think they were guys, weren't they?
I think the early ones were, yes. I do remember organising them. So I remember disasters like power cuts in the middle of presentations, and Marion McAllister doing a presentation on some complex subject, just talking, and I wanted to kiss her. But I do remember, yes. I mean, I think that guys were very involved in organising the early annual meetings, and my memory was that people were just invited to speak. There was no submission of papers, that we weren't at that stage yet, or having posters or anything. But I think that we just some of us who were on the organising committee would say, well, we think that person A, B, C, and D have got something to say, and we'll invite them, and mostly people used to come. And so they were. It's funny, isn't it? Yes, you're right, because they were. I sort of feel that they were forever there, but they weren't necessarily. We used to sort of go to the BSHG, or whatever it was then called, BSGM, BSHG then, BSGM now, and occasionally you'd find somebody giving a paper at that, but otherwise no, we didn't have any separate meetings. But then we developed some. And my memory was that that those of us who were involved in developing a registration process were also involved in that as well. And so no, I'd sort of forgotten about those, but yes, we take them for granted now. But yes, they were early days, and they were very well attended and very popular.
And most of the genetic nurses and counsellors came, but at one stage it could have only been about 50.
Oh yeah, yes. There was no more than that. They used to take place on the top of the guy's tower. You attract people there with view, genetics. So yes, no, there was only been about 50, but that was probably the only one there were of us, wasn't there?
Yes.
I think that's right. Yeah, and it was certainly pre-registration, and I think that those early days, the talks were all clinical, or what I call psychosocial, as opposed to anything to do with the development of the profession and training. That's my memory.
You were more involved with MPAG, I think, than I ever was. The European meeting on the psychosocial aspect of genetics.
I think I was. I may have also been on that. I seem to get myself in all sorts of places. No, MPAG. I haven't thought about MPAG, but MPAG is obviously now, my understanding, doesn't exist in its own right, really. But I went to the very first. It wasn't even called MPAG then. It was a meeting organised. This was the year I joined genetics. I'm pretty sure that it was 1988, and there was a social worker in Groningen. Was it Groningen? I think is Groningen the Netherlands? I think it was Groningen. Yes, that north. There was a group of Dutch social workers who started what became MPAG. And they were. So 1988 was the year I joined, and I'm sure that was the year of the first meeting. It was in Amsterdam. We got in Groningen, and then obviously it became part of the European meeting. But there was a lot of controversy about whether to link up with the what I'll call the doctors' meeting. Yeah, because I remember the Dutch contingent felt very strongly they wanted to remain separate. Whereas obviously there was a group of people who felt that there was a huge benefit in linking up with the European meeting, and I think that the Dutch folk kind of withdrew their labour as a result. and I remember that, yes, and so then it became obviously more involved and more organised jointly. But I think MPAG meetings were very important for me. I had no idea what was happening in the rest of Europe, and it's in the rest of Europe primarily genetic counselling as we know it and we call it was done by doctors, and the people who came to MPAG who were not English, the European and some Americans used to come, if you remember. There were quite a lot of Americans used to come, and they were people who often were psychologists, often doctors, but doctors who had more of an interest in the sort of psychosocial aspects of genetics, and nurses. Yeah, so there were very few. I think that's what made me realise that genetic counselling in the rest of Europe was relatively rudimentary in terms of its development and concepts. But they were great meetings because I learned a lot about Europeans, and they took places in very nice places, and yeah, no, they were good. And some of us, I think, wrote papers about to report the meetings in the old days when we had the genetics journal. I know I did one for Rome, and no, that's and I know that MPAG has been it's now part of the European meeting, but it did start. It had very important roots, that were divorced from what I'll call mainstream genetics.
Yes, I mean, I wasn't heavily involved, but it seems to me it also started a conversation about trying to create an academic knowledge base for what we did.
Yes,
and I think people like Heather have contributed to that, and lots of other people have. Yeah. Which also became important when we were having the discussions about regulation, because we had to make the argument that there was a defined knowledge base for what we did.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely right, and that was very important, and that did not exist in many other European situations, if any.
No.
I think that there were some extraordinary people who worked in Finland and such places. Two nurses, one who dealt with North Finland and the other one dealt with South Finland, and they spent all their time on planes going from family to family, and it was extremely useful to talk about people's different working situations and the different situations for families in different countries, and particularly countries who did not have an NHS or the equivalent. So no, they were good meetings. They were very good, and very enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah, I was always very jealous of the people that got there. I never managed to get into that network. I
remember once Lauren was very involved in MPAG, and she said to me once, there was a, I think it was in Strasbourg, and they were doing it was their first kind of joint session with doctors, and I had just finished my MSc and written up my research, and I did views of parents about testing children for translocations, which was my MSc thesis. And Lauren said, would I go and talk about that? And she made it sound like a very kind of small meeting. And then when I got to Strasbourg, and I said, could I see where I was going to speak? And it was a bit like speaking in a football stadium. And there were going to be 2,000 people. And I remember thinking, it's a good job I like Lauren Kurtzensdorfer, because this would be the end of our friendship otherwise, because she couldn't speak. So they'd asked her to speak, and she couldn't. So she asked me, and I think that was very important, because there were obviously a lot of genetic counsellors there, and I could not have been more nervous if I lived to be 90, and But I did it, and the thing that people said afterwards was that my presentation was much better than the two professors I was speaking with, only in the sense that it actually was understood by and was more important in a psychosocial sphere than these two extremely eminent, knowledgeable, old professors. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that was it's one of the great memories of my profession is surviving that, and thinking actually, we as a profession can do this. We can be involved on that kind of level and be taken seriously. And I had a lot of afterwards. I had a lot of people from different countries, a lot of doctors coming up to me to say how good they'd found it and how it made them think about the parent situation. And that was good. It was good.
Yeah.
So I'd sort of forgotten about impact, but it was. I think it was very important in also people cutting their teeth in presenting to scary audiences. Yeah, it's important. Yeah,
yeah.
Surviving. Yeah.
So it's always seemed to me that for me, one of the seminal tipping points for what we've done was the meeting where we wrote the registration process.
Yes.
Where we sort of locked ourselves in a cheap hotel in London in a conservatory.
Yes, exactly.
I wrote it. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. I mean, I hadn't been in genetics that long. I don't know what year that was, Chris, but it must have been in the early 90s. I remember that very well. And I also remember some statements, probably some of which I made, sort of saying, well, really, how difficult can it be? We reached a stage where thinking what we were doing could be somehow easily described, and because those of us who were doing it were very confident that in what we were doing, I guess that it was going to be very easy to document it and to assess it, to assess people's competence. And when I think now about how what a huge piece of work a portfolio is to put together for most people, and how complicated it is, and how extensive. And I don't think we'd really thought about master's level submissions and all this kind of stuff. If I think now, obviously as the GCRB administrator, I do see portfolies, and I was thinking what astonishing pieces of work they are, and quite rightly have to be in order to gain GCRB registration. I think going back to the Conservatory, I think that we thought that the process was going to be comparatively simple.
Yeah.
And I think that
structure with little detail on how it was going to be achieved.
I think that's absolutely right. But it was important because this was really the early work on getting a structure, and getting some sort of assessment process on whether somebody was safe and competent. Which I'm sure if we could go back to those meetings, they would be slightly laughable in the sense the simplicity. I mean, the ideas were, but I think that we did. My view, anyway, is that I grossly underestimated the complexity of developing a registration process and running it so that you ensured patient safety and knowledge. And I think because I think they were simpler times.
Yes,
they were simpler times. Because the role of the genetic counsellor was. It was more. If you think about those times, Chris, I'm very aware that when I used to go to GCRB AGNC meetings, that a lot of genetic counsellors in the UK, certainly we at Guy's, were quite unusual in having our own clinics. We'd always had our own clinics, but a lot of genetic counsellors nationally were still basically sitting in with doctors, and offering support and follow up. So they would ring the patient after the day after, saying, how did you find the appointment with your doctor? I think that a lot of them didn't have an autonomous role.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, to be fair, we at Guys did have one, and I think that was just how genetic counsellors were appointed and how we were set up. But I think that a lot of genetic counsellors did not have an autonomous role, and I think that the registration process was completely vital in them getting an autonomous role, and it's probably what you needed to do as a genetic counsellor. And I've always suspected that a lot of people who did not go through the registration process probably carried on doing what they were doing without ever developing an autonomous role. I hope that's not the case now, but I think it was in the early days.
Yeah, no. I think that it's really interesting reflecting back, because you realise that part of it is a series of accidents of things coming together, like changes in genomics, changes in health professional regulation, changes in pay structures and structures within the NHS. But there's this thread through of individuals with a vision of what they want for patients, but also what they want professionals to, or how they want professionals to be, what skills and competencies they want them to have to be able to practice safely and effectively.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that we've been very lucky in that I think we've always had a core of people. I was going to say like yourself, but I won't.
No. There's lots of people.
There's been a core set of people who have thought through these things all the way along, and I suppose they would describe as being slightly ahead of their time, in the sense that you always need people who are going to think, well, we're okay now, but what about this profession in 2 years' time? Or is the way that we're appointing and organising genetic counselling training, is that going to be okay for the future? And I think that people have. I think that was something that I was very aware of, that I wasn't a great. I wasn't going to change things, but I'm a very good person to have on your side if you want to do a piece of work. Yeah.
Yes.
But often I don't have the confidence or the far-sightedness to think, actually, this is the piece of work that needs to be done in this way. But I've been very lucky to work with a lot of people in the profession who have had that vision and confidence.
I think you're being modest, Chris. I really do.
I'm never modest.
But I think it's about having people who are committed to it and then doing the things that they're good at.
Well, I absolutely.
I would have been absolutely hopeless. Your rigorous attention to detail and your desire to engage with spreadsheets and things like that.
Well, no, I mean that's there are advantages to having OCD, I think, but there are huge disadvantages. But there are certain advantages, and I think that people with OCD are needed in all these activities. Really.
Yes, you need a mixture of abilities, but you need the people who are enthusiastic, committed, and who. This has been a hell of a lot of work by a lot of people who've done it predominantly outside their paid employment.
Somehow, I can't remember, maybe about 6 months ago, somebody asked me about the report that we submitted to the PSA, and which I obviously have still got on my computer, as well as some copies. That I remember thinking, actually, this was a very important piece of work that nobody now reads, of course.
No.
But if you look at that, the inherent structure of the profession is described, and the future predicted, and the important areas highlighted.
Yes.
And I think that piece of work needed to be done. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it would be a shame if this is why the work that you're doing now with these interviews are so important, because I think it would be such a shame if that's disappeared, because I think it does show a very important messages about the development of a profession, which is outside of genetic counselling as well. This is how you develop a profession in this way. And I only thought about that 6 months ago, having just kind of read it again, really, or found it in the bottom of my cupboard. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Chris, is there anything else you want to talk about?
I'm just trying to think. I just wanted to say, yes, there are just a few things I'd written down, if I may. I just think that I think it's superb that, you know, I've been part of a profession that has come so far in 30 years, which is roughly what it is. I think that to be involved in the early development of a profession has been, you know, it's been a hugely pleasurable part of my life, and I feel very privileged to have done that, really. I think the statutory regulation in itself, if you have to say, well, what is the most important development in that time? And I think the answer to that, for me, is statutory regulation. That what we're doing is ensuring a system whereby patients are treated safely. Yeah. And I think that you know, that's been such. I think that's in a way, that's what everything has been leading up to. If you know what I mean. But it's also enabled genetic counsellors to become influential professionals in their own right, which I think has also been very important. I think it's a shame that very few nurses, as far as I can see, are entering the profession. I think that's a great shame, and if there could be a mechanism whereby that trend is reversed, or even slowly reversed, that I think that would, because I think that people who have a nursing background often have a lot to offer, often, and certainly some of the early, you know, pioneers in the development of the whole profession have been nurses, and that I don't think that should be forgotten. So, and I just think that you and I have been around in genetics and the genetic counselling in the UK at a time that's been really, I think we were very privileged. I think we're very privileged to have been exposed to this and to be able to contribute a bit to it, and to think about patient safety and the challenges of ensuring patient safety in this world where we now have COVID. All the resources are going to go to COVID, where we have a government that does not have any plans to fund the NHS in any proper manner. That's in my opinion, and I think that genetics is going to go so that genetics departments are going to change enormously, and I think that the role of the clinical geneticist is going to change enormously, and I think that the next 20 years will be very, and I hope there's somebody doing this in 20 years' time, recording, what the last 20 years have been like, and I think it's been really important.
Yeah. No, it feels to me this a huge privilege that this working life has been bookended by. It's sort of neat in a way. It's been bookended by the start of the profession, building on what had been done before,
yes,
and by the transition to the next stage, and other people will have to build on what we've done.
And I just feel extraordinarily lucky that I got involved in a profession I didn't know anything about. I'm afraid I came to genetic counselling because I needed a job. My research money had run out for my previous project, and I happened to meet an old friend at a party who was the genetic counsellor at Guy's, and I said I needed a job, and she said, well, we need person number 2, it completely fortuitous. If I had not gone to that party, my life may have been very different. Well, would have been very different, because I didn't know anything about genetics or genetic counselling. So I think that it reminds you that certain things happen to you in life that are completely fortuitous, that change the course of your life for the better. And I think that's what it's done for me. Really.
Well, that sounds like a wrap to me.
Yeah.